Okay, guys, so I'm here in Krakow, Poland at the Krakow Music Conference, and I'm going to be teaching a masterclass here tomorrow called How to Practice with Maximum Efficiency. I was invited to come out here to the conference to teach this masterclass based on the book that I wrote with the same title. So we're going to really get into a deep dive about practice, talk about defining practice in all aspects of practice, talk about time management, which is such a big subject when it comes to practice, and also delving into all the effective practice principles that I've come up with over the years, and then how to put those principles into action. So it's going to be really cool. But today I thought I'd just take a little bit time out and talk about a subject that I get questions about all the time, and this is transcription. So what I'm going to talk about today is my top 10 transcription tips. As I mentioned earlier, this subject is really vast, so if I haven't covered something that you've got questions about today, then just leave those questions in the comment section below. Okay, so top tip number one is make sure that you're transcribing something that you just have to learn. This is super important. You've got to want to learn to do something when you're sitting down to go through all the sort of rigorous process of transcription. I remember one of the first things that I attempted to transcribe was a tune called Vulcan Worlds on a Chick Corea record. I think it was on the record called Where Have I Known You Before? And it was a Stanley Clarke tune. And there was a section in the middle of that tune which was this just insane bass line. And I just heard it and I thought, I've got to know how to play that. I just have to know this. And very often when I've transcribed things through the years, I mean, sometimes, yes, I've done things as an assignment for a teacher I was studying with, and then saw the value in that as they wanted me to pick out specific characteristics of a player's style or a specific subject matter that we were working on at the time. But aside from that, I really think that there's a lot of power in loving what you want to sit down and transcribe, because the process is very arduous to go through. So that's the first tip. Top tip number two is listen to what you want to transcribe every day for a whole week before you sit down and start transcribing it. This is key. You've got to understand and be familiar with what you are transcribing. And it's not like, you're just throwing on a CD and while you're cooking dinner or something. You've got to sit and really have dedicated, critical listening to the track that you're doing. So by the time that week has elapsed, you've listened to that track hundreds of times, or it just might be a portion of the track. It might just be a solo, or it might just be a section of a solo. Whatever it is, make sure that you devote a week. That's my standard operating procedure. I tell all my students to do that, and they have very good results by applying this second top tip. Okay, so top tip number three is make sure to use an instrument to check every phrase is correct that you're transcribing. Some people think this is a bit of a cheat, but it really isn't, because even a lot of people that recommend that you solely do something by ear are using an instrument to create a reference point before they begin to hear where those pitches lie, okay? There is a thing, though, that rather than trying to transcribe something with an instrument where you're just searching for the note by trying to find it on your instrument, just note by note, and you're using that as like your fingers are trying to find the note, use your ears to hear the phrase and then adopt that to check on your instrument. This is very important. It's a subtle difference, but it'll make a huge difference. If you're always just using your fingers, then it's just like this endless process of elimination before you just can even find the starting note of the phrase. Again, singing the thing back is also good, but make sure to check with an instrument that it is correct. And also, you don't necessarily have to transcribe with your bass. You can do it with a keyboard. I often recommend people do that, especially if they're transcribing a piano solo. Use a piano sound as your reference point for getting the notes. Also, if you're transcribing a saxophone solo, you could get a sort of sax sample in your keyboard to just have a little bit more of that solid connection towards doing that. That's very helpful. Top tip number 4 is making sure to sketch out the form of what you're transcribing before you sit down to transcribe. So you might want to listen to the intro of the tune and say there's an 8-bar intro. You might say the A section is 12 bars. The B section is 8 bars, and then it goes back to the A section, which is another 12 bars. So, or it just might be a form of a solo. You might have an A-B-A form, and you want to get that sketched out in advance so you know how many bars are ahead of you within the idea of sitting down to transcribe this. Top tip number 5 is use modern technology to your advantage. This is super important. There's lots of things we can use now. Back in the old days when I first started doing this, I was using a record player, dropping the needle, scratching all my records in the process, and it was just a nightmare. I remember the evolution is that people started to get tape players that slowed down. I remember getting the Marantz cassette player that went half speed, and that was a very useful thing to get that. And I also remember when I was at Berkeley the second time, finding out that Mike Stern, he was studying with Charlie Banakis in person at that time because he lived in Boston, and that he invested in one of those super duper Tascam reel-to-reel recorders where you could slow it down 3 times. Now, the thing is, back in those days, it slowed it down, but it went, it also brought the pitch down an octave when it slowed it down. So now you have things like Transcribe, or there's the other software package called the Amazing Slow Downer, where you can slow things down and the pitch doesn't change. There are some guys out there that kind of rag on this and think it's a cheat. They think, you should transcribe everything at full tempo. But the same guys that are saying that are still looping sections. I've never really understood why slowing down is a bad thing, especially in that those same guys are recommending that you slow things down to learn how to play something. So your ears work in the same way. In other words, speed is developed as a reflex of what you know. And a lot of transcription is based on what you already know as well. Some people think that if somebody can hear a major 7 sharp 11 chord without even checking it, they might just hear the chord and they'll go, that's a major 7 sharp 11. They may then go to check it and it's right, and then you look at that and you go, wow, this guy's amazing. He's got huge ears. I mean, how did he do that? He must just be talented. Again, the reason he knows it is because he's heard it before and he's logged that into his memory. A lot of ear training is based on memorization of the things that you're trying to hear. So phrases are the same thing. There's a lot of characteristic things that people play, especially in jazz, and you'll hear the way people play something and you'll go, oh, I kind of know what that pattern is, or I know a deviation of that pattern. So you're much quicker to be able to hear it and write it down. And a lot of that's based on that. So speed is a byproduct of knowing what you're doing. To play fast, you have to know it. You have to know, the material. You can't just learn something by rote and play it fast. I mean, you can, but you just have to practice it all the time. I mean, relentlessly. But a good player who actually knows the sound of something, once he develops the understanding of that, playing it fast, he can do that repetitively because he understands the sound with very little maintenance work that goes behind that. A lot of people don't realize this. I've had students that have come in and they've burned over a minor seventh chord, and then I give them exercises over a minor 7 flat 5, and they come back the next week and say, yeah, it's weird, the technique on a minor 7 flat 5 is a lot harder than the technique on a minor 7 chord. And that's not the deal. The deal is they can't hear the ideas on a minor 7 flat 5 chord, therefore they can't play it fast yet. So the same thing when you're trying to hear something, you can train your ear to be much faster by slowing things down. It only makes sense. So don't be ashamed of that. Many top players slow things down. I've read articles about Steve Vai, who's the world's most famous transcriber, transcribing the whole Zappa catalog. And of course, he slowed things down, so it's like it doesn't really matter. But one of the tips for slowing down, especially on these digital formats, is that try not to slow it down slower than 50%. And the reason is that it starts to kind of change the character of the notes. There's some digital glitches that get in there and it becomes a little odd. I usually, if I'm transcribing something that I'm having trouble with, I'll slow it down to about 75%. And I do recommend a lot of my students do the same thing. Try it around 75%. And then also, this will kind of help when you start to, learn how to play this stuff as well. So anyway, take that to heart, and as I said, use technology to your advantage. Okay, so the next top tip, which is number 6, is transcribe in small chunks. This is super important. Don't try to finish the solo in one sitting. So many people do this and they stay up for 14 hours transcribing something. Your ears burn out very quickly. I can't tell you the number of times where I was in the recording studio for up to 10, 12 hours of recording with artists or even some of my own projects, where at the end of the day I'd be looking at someone going like, I can't even hear if that's right or wrong. Can you? It just, your ears fatigue so quickly. So make sure to just bite-sized chunk this. Do about 10 or 15 minutes a day, or no more than an hour a day of transcribing. That way, it might take you a month to transcribe a solo, if a solo is like 6 or 7 choruses, but it doesn't matter, because within that time, you'll build up some real skills along the way as well, and your ears won't be fried, and you'll find that you're making far less mistakes. Okay, so top tip number 7 is learn how to play everything as you transcribe it. I'm a big proponent of this, that as you transcribe the first 4 bars, learn how to play it right there. And on the bass, there's so many factors when you're learning how to play something. And, you've got to really figure out, how you're going to play these things, especially if you're transcribing something from another instrumentalist, such as a pianist or a saxophone player. So this is super important. One of the worst things that you can do, and a lot of students that I've come across violate this thing, is where you transcribe a load of things, but you never play them. You never learn them. So past the idea that, you get a bit of ear training and you get a bit of practice writing rhythms down, that's about it. You get very little out of that. You're really transcribing so you can get inside of the player's characteristic style and then be able to pull and extract things out of that so you can use them on other things. This is key. You're not transcribing something to do a play along on YouTube. That's pointless, okay? You're transcribing things so you can use things later and you can build your vocabulary exponentially. Okay, so top tip number 8 is once you've written everything out, analyze what you've written. This is super important. I saw this, there was a great tip that I got from the Dave Liebman site where he talks about transcription. It might still be on his site. It might be worth looking, searching out to find, where he would transcribe, 4 choruses of a solo. and then he would write it out where it was like on a stave. So let's say it was 4 choruses of a blues, and a blues, the form of a blues is 12 bars, and so he'd have like 12 bars, but he'd have 4 staves, so he could see underneath each bar the difference of what the guy played, chorus by chorus. And this helps you to identify commonalities of players. And it's a very cool exercise to do. The other thing, again, go in to do a note-by-note analysis. If you haven't got the PDF from my Jaco video that I did last week, then make sure you check that out, because I do a note-by-note analysis of the line that I played, and I go through that very thoroughly, where I'm identifying chromatic approach note combinations, scale passing tones, diatonic approach notes, chord tones, etc. Make sure that you understand what those things are, because that's very helpful when you go to extract those ideas out of the transcription and start to use it on something. Okay, so top tip number 9 is, after you've got everything written out and analyzed, what you want to do is you want to start to learn how to play this thing. And you want to learn it with the goal in mind that you're going to play it at the same tempo of the original artist that you've transcribed it from. And what's really great about this, because it might take a while to build up to this, is what I say, if you slow it down to about 75% to transcribe it, it's probably a good place to start practicing to try to play it with the recording. And you want to learn it. You want to memorize what you're doing. You don't want to just kind of try to read along with it or use the chart as a crutch. This shows you that you could really ostensibly work on one solo for 6 months, if not longer, to really get it down, depending upon your level and everything. These things take time to do it right. So that's the goal. Play it with the recording. Now, I recommend that you slow this down, and that's why we were talking about that 75% of the original tempo. That's a good place to start, so you can then build into the full tempo. Really work on the phraseology, work on making the notes that are short, and the ones that are long, and really match that phrasing that you've heard from the original artist. So last but not least is top tip number 10. This is where you want to start to identify the characteristic lines and start to pull small phrases and ideas out and isolate those phrases, and also learn to transpose these lines over different chord types. Sometimes you'll probably be a little selective over this if you've transcribed a whole solo. So think of it, if you've transcribed a solo and you can pull out 10 2-beat or 4-beat phrases from that, and then start transcribing it over every different chord type. I mean, this is months and months of work to get this together, but this is how you really start to expand your vocabulary, by doing this. So this is like a little post-care on all the time that you spent transcribing, learning how to play the solo. And now what we want is we want to have some longevity in how we're going to use these ideas to affect our building vocabulary of ideas. Okay, so that's it for today. Make sure that you subscribe and like, and don't forget to check out my courses, my books, and my lessons over at joehubbardbass.com. Until next time, practice smart, work hard, and play creatively.